Hello, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you enjoy this conversation on Trendlines, you can get more of WPR's news and analysis directly in your inbox by registering for our free daily newsletter. You'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. Most people know the social media platform TikTok for its short viral videos of dance-offs, pranks, comedy sketches, drawing contests, and athletic feats. Even if you've never heard of it, there's a good chance you've engaged with TikTok content online, including the comedian Sarah Cooper's withering clips of lip-synced sound bites from President Donald Trump. Since its initial debut in China in 2016, TikTok has been downloaded at least 2 billion times and was the most downloaded program on Apple's App Store in both 2018 and 2019. More recently, though, this tremendously popular app and its Chinese parent company ByteDance have found themselves facing a serious and costly PR crisis. In June, India banned dozens of Chinese apps over national security concerns, including TikTok, causing it to lose billions of dollars in revenue. Officials in Australia are reportedly investigating the app, and here in the United States, the Trump administration is also considering an outright ban. Now, Microsoft has said it wants to buy TikTok's operations in the US, as well as in Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. President Donald Trump said last Friday he would ban TikTok from the U.S., but then climbed down from that position after a conversation over the weekend with Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella. The president now appears to favor a, quote, very American company buying TikTok, but only if the U.S. government gets a cut. It's worth mentioning that TikTok strenuously denies any impropriety, arguing that many of its senior leaders, including its CEO, are American and that it stores user data on servers in the United States and Singapore. The company says it has never provided any user data to the Chinese government and would not do so if asked. But as with many issues around technology and privacy, the real story is murky. Joining me now to shed some light on the debate over TikTok, its relationship with the Chinese Communist Party, and what it all means for your data are two analysts from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Samantha Hoffman specializes in the domestic and global implications of China's technology-enhanced authoritarianism, and Fergus Ryan works on issues related to Chinese social media, censorship, and cyber sovereignty. They're joining us from Canberra. Sam and Fergus, welcome to Trendlines.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Very glad to have you both with us. I wanted to start with what we know. According to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, TikTok users might as well be handing over their private information to the Chinese Communist Party. Is there any evidence of that?
I think you only need to look at what ByteDance says themselves. So, the company says that they store TikTok user data in Singapore and in the United States, but they're very careful to never say that while this data may be stored in those two locations, that it's not being accessed by ByteDance employees back in China. And the reason why they don't say that clearly is because it's highly likely that they are accessing TikTok user data from Beijing. And it makes sense because if they are to update the app, if they are to understand the users that they have, if they want to continue to make the app a better experience for their users, they need to be looking at some data. So I don't really have any evidence to suggest that they are not storing the data outside of China, but by their very own admission, they are most certainly still accessing it from China. TikTok's CISO, in an April blog post, said that it is the goal of TikTok to minimize access to TikTok user data by employees in China. So that he was talking about that being a goal, and that the goal was not to completely cut off China-based employees from the user data, but to minimize their access. So even by their own statements, it's clear that they are still accessing this user data. So where it's stored is a bit of a red herring.
So I'd just add to what Fergus has described that exactly as Fergus said, the types of data collection that could be taking place and the uses for it could be very normal, and in fact they have to be for the app to continue improving. But then the next question is how else is that same data used? And I think it's hard for an individual TikTok user who's just using it for fun to understand how a video of them engaging in just social activity could have security implications. I think at the most basic level, if you think about the kinds of data that TikTok has access to, they have access to data that can be used to make facial recognition data, AI algorithms more accurate, for instance. And what are the security implications of that? Well, we see in the PRC how such technology is used in very invasive ways for surveillance, and the more accurate it is, the more effective it can be. So the more kinds of, like, for instance, face data that you have, the more effective that's going to be. Another thing is if you have a sense of how society or various parts of society are influenced, that can be very useful from a propaganda perspective. It's the same idea that why advertisers would find that data useful. The data could also be exploited by other actors who are interested in it for reasons that affect our security in the long term. And in fact, I think there was a California lawsuit filed last year that suggested that TikTok was collecting its users' face data and sending it back to the PRC.
Part of the debate here in the US has focused on how TikTok's mining of user data and personal information compares to American tech giants like Google and Facebook and the kind of data that they collect on users. Would you say it's a fair comparison between the two, or how do they stack up?
So I think that from my perspective, what a company like TikTok is doing isn't fundamentally different. The difference is potentially the intent and how that data can be used. It's from my perspective and the research that I'm doing, sometimes the technical side isn't necessarily that unique. It's about the intent behind that collection, and sometimes that can be multiple things, as Fergus and I both said earlier, that part of the data collection is about the app and making the service better, but it doesn't mean that there can't be many other uses for the same exact data, and that's the problem. And so then you have to look at what the company says, and also what its parent company says about, for instance, politics, and how it complies, and what laws it complies with, for instance, because then that tells you a little bit more about intent.
Do we know anything about ByteDance, TikTok's parent company, and its politics and its history of working with the Chinese government? Are there any examples from the past that might be instructive here?
There are many very instructive anecdotes to talk about. I think the most infamous one, at least in circles of China watchers, is when in 2018, Zhang Yiming, the 37-year-old CEO of ByteDance, got into trouble. Now, what had happened was he had an app called Neihan Duanzi, and this was kind of like a GIF, funny GIFs, memes, jokes that were being shared on it. But the Chinese Communist Party got very paranoid about it. We don't know exactly why, but one of the best arguments that certainly makes sense to me is that the CCP was very scared about how people were starting to organize on the app. So what was happening was a lot of the users of this particular app who generally came from not the major cities in China, but more what they call second and third tier cities, started to meet up offline after they'd forged friendships on the app and were starting to organize. And if there's anything that makes the Chinese Communist Party paranoid, it's that. It's when people start to group together in organizations that the CCP doesn't have complete oversight into. So that's just the context of what was happening with that app. Anyway, the regulators banned it. And this was an existential crisis for ByteDance because this was an important part of their app ecosystem. And it was a very clear signal from the regulators, from the government, from the party, that ByteDance needed to make sure that while it was pursuing its commercial goals, it had to also keep top of mind the goals of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, this isn't speculation. We know this for a fact because Jiang Yiming, after this happened, came out and publicly published a letter in which he essentially said that he recognized that he hadn't been keeping the CCP top of mind. He hadn't been considering the goals of the party and how censorship and propaganda are important. And he apologized for it. And he committed to correcting that mistake. After he made this apology, the company went on to hire at least 2,000 extra censors to work at ByteDance. And when they put out the job ads for those censors, they specified that they wanted people who were loyal to the Chinese Communist Party. So what I've just outlined is actually quite remarkable. You know, if as a non-Chinese person in the United States or Australia or the UK or anywhere on the planet outside of China heard, for example, that Mark Zuckerberg had put out a letter last night saying that he was so sorry for not supporting Donald Trump's policy prescriptions and his campaign, and that he was committing himself to serving only the Republican Party in the United States, everyone would be rightly shocked and appalled.
It would certainly buy him back a lot of goodwill that he's lost among Republicans here, though.
Yes, probably. It might be a sort of a Hail Mary move that they could make now to stave off being banned. But you know, I think it's important to step back and think about, you know, how would we think about this if it was in a different context? And I think that, you know, most people would be really shocked that the head of a tech company, the head of a social media platform would say such a thing. But that's precisely what happened with Jiang Yiming and ByteDance.
You know, another interesting thing is the presence of party committees, both in ByteDance as well as the growth of the presence of party committees across tech companies, especially tech companies in the PRC over the last several years. And one thing that you sometimes hear from analysts is, well, you know, the party committees, and I'm referring to Chinese Communist Party committees embedded in these organizations, structures. The party committees, they don't really mean much. They're just, they're there because they have to be there, but, people don't really like participating. But I think that's not the point. The point is that they're there and they have to be there, and they have to be there in order for a business to survive increasingly. And that on its own is important. It's almost as if I remember one time a conversation that I was having while I was visiting China about 2.5 years ago. And the person that I was talking to noticed that I was taking pictures of propaganda signs. And he said, "Oh, I don't understand why you're taking a picture of that, because it doesn't mean anything to me." And my response is, "Well, why are you hanging it in this building then? Why is it on that billboard if it doesn't matter?" And it's kind of the same when you think about the party. It's not just an obligation that people post and forget about it. It's one that matters. And if it matters for a company that's based in the PRC, it also affects companies that are based outside of the PRC but have significant interests in China. We saw Zoom earlier this year claim that it was complying with local law when it removed users from its platform who were organizing a Tiananmen commemoration event. And in fact, we see companies that don't have any particular structural link to the PRC doing this all the time to comply with law, and sometimes not even clear about what laws they're complying with, only that they were pressured to do so. So if that level of pressure exists for companies that are even sort of outside of the PRC, imagine what it's like for a company that's operating there.
In a way, that strikes me as the time when censorship has become most successful, or when it's reached its zenith, right? When you have committee members embedded in corporate offices and people just don't really think much of it, or when the message becomes so ubiquitous that it becomes part of the atmosphere.
Yeah.
So getting back to the recent developments with Microsoft, Microsoft says that in the event of a deal with TikTok, it would preserve any data of American users in the United States. And we should note that caveat, because Microsoft has said that a deal could fall through if it isn't reached in 45 days. But would preserving that data of American users here in the US fully address any security concerns or the kind of things that you both have mentioned in terms of the intent of what China can do with that data?
That's a great question, and I don't have a ready and complete answer, because this is, obviously a breaking news story. And it's certainly something that I want to look into further. But, one thing that I can say about the possibility of Microsoft buying part of the TikTok business, because let's not forget, in the preliminary proposal that Microsoft put out, they have suggested that they will buy TikTok in the US, Australia, New Zealand, and I think Canada, which notably are four members of the Five Eyes. The only missing piece in that puzzle is the UK, which is interesting. So effectively, if this Microsoft deal were to go through, and as you say, there's a 45-day deadline on that to happen, we will essentially end up with there being 3 TikToks on the planet. Because remember that before TikTok, there was Douyin. So Douyin is essentially the Chinese version of TikTok, which operates inside the Great Firewall in China. Then, obviously, we have TikTok that has grown so rapidly around the planet now. And if Microsoft were to buy off the TikTok business in those few countries, there would be this Microsoft-controlled TikTok, leaving the rest of the world still using ByteDance-controlled TikTok. So, the other really important part of this story, aside from the surveillance aspect, is how the platform can be used as a conduit for propaganda. Now, when people think about that, they immediately think of, perhaps Chinese state media accounts flooding the platform and TikTok ensuring that only pro-Beijing content is promoted. And having looked at the app, I've found that that's not really the case, at least yet. In fact, it's platforms like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter that are awash with Chinese state media propaganda and other related pro-Beijing propaganda. It's one of the ironies of this story is that on TikTok, at least at the moment, there doesn't seem to be that much of that type of activity on the platform.
Meanwhile, Twitter is banned in China, and yet you have wolf warrior diplomats and other officials partaking in a disinformation campaign openly on a U.S. social media platform.
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time that they are given free rein to do that on Twitter, the accounts of foreign embassies on Weibo, which is the sort of Chinese analog of Twitter, are constantly censored. And the accounts that they have on WeChat as well are increasingly being censored. So it's not a two-way street. But to return to what I was saying, the problem with TikTok is that they clearly made a strategic decision. Well, they made a couple of strategic decisions. The first one was, we are going to have a version of the app called Douyin, and that's going to operate in China, and that's going to be heavily censored and surveilled. Then they said, to ensure that we don't scare the horses outside of China, we're going to have a different app, and we're going to ring fence it from that original app. And hopefully that will ensure that people don't freak out too much about the fact that it's a Chinese-owned app. Now, that didn't solve the problem with the surveillance aspect, because they have, as we were discussing before, all their infrastructure for crunching the data, for updating their algorithm, for updating the app, that all resides in China. So whatever they say about data being stored overseas, they are still accessing that from China. But the second strategic decision that they made was, we are going to be politics free. So we are going to be all about fun and entertainment. And, I think that decision could only really be made by people operating in a tech sector that comes from China, because the idea that you could do that makes sense in the Chinese context, because censorship is an accepted part of their system there. But it was never going to fly outside of China. The young people who use this app, sure, they're into beauty tips, and they're into dancing, and they're into lip syncing, and they're into funny memes. But let's not forget that they're also one of the most political generations that we've seen in decades. They're out there talking about climate change. They're out there talking about Black Lives Matter. Any range of issues, younger people today are very active about it. So it was inevitable that TikTok was going to be used by these young people in a political way. And there is plenty of evidence that has been reported out by publications like The Guardian in the UK, Netzpolitik in Germany, and NRC in the Netherlands, who have made it very clear that the modus operandi at ByteDance, as they were expanding around the world, was, we don't want politics. If people get too political on the platform, we're going to censor them. Now, obviously, following the murder of George Floyd and the protests that have been going on in the United States and the rest of the world, including here in Australia where I am, that was a political issue that TikTok simply could not ignore. So when you open up TikTok at the moment, and you go to the Discover page where they list all the different hashtags that they are suggesting that their users get involved in, for the most part, 99% is politics free. But then you will have some token instances of Black Lives Matter being part of the conversation. Now, that's great. That's an improvement on it being totally politics free. But that's not the only political issue out there that people are discussing. But it's not being presented to you on TikTok because that's not what they want the app to be about.
And I just add 2 points to what Fergus has described to reinforce his points. One is that the decision to avoid politics is a political decision. When you're in the PRC, for instance, and you meet somebody who says, "Oh, I'm not really interested in politics," that's also that's the effect over time of the political landscape, because avoiding politics is also a way of avoiding difficulty. And it's a way of getting on with your life and having normalcy without having to deal with the implications of being political. So that's one point. And then the other point is that propaganda, for the app to be used for propaganda purposes, it does not mean that the propaganda has to be taking place on the app. Rather, that the data collected supports the awareness of how particular groups in society can be influenced. And then that data can be used in other ways. So it's not necessarily a requirement that the propaganda then gets fed into the app itself. Rather, it helps to inform how particular debates can be exploited. Fergus mentioned the Black Lives Matter protest, and I would argue that the Communist Party doesn't particularly care about racism in America because it genuinely cares about solving the problem. I mean, all you have to do is look at what the CCP is doing in Xinjiang, for instance. Is currently what I'd call a cultural genocide taking place against the Uyghur population, and so I don't think that that's in the CCP's interest. But you see them using those debates, for instance, to then justify its actions in Hong Kong, among other things. And so it's a way of also just sort of using information and understanding how to exploit narratives in a way that suits the party's interests. None of that is new, but technology can help support the accuracy or effectiveness of that information. In the same way that it's revolutionized the advertising industry, it can also revolutionize information operations, I think.
It seems to me that there's a tension in what you're both describing of the Chinese Communist Party wanting to promote ByteDance and TikTok and WeChat, other Chinese technology giants as their national champions and wanting them to gain market share and gain a foothold overseas. But at the same time, a lot of these aspects of TikTok's operations that you're talking about around censorship in various forms do sort of cloud the minds of potential users and do potentially sort of create a negative perception in people's minds. How has the Chinese government approached that and trying to strike a balance there between getting their technology to market overseas, but meanwhile preventing it from becoming something that is too closely associated with the Chinese Communist Party?
We only need to look at what the party state have been saying recently about TikTok and its potential ban around the world. Just last week, we had a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson talk about it being a Chinese app and how it was unfair that it was being singled out in this way. Now, that contrasts to the talking points that you get from TikTok, who have actually said to the New York Times, oh no, we're not a Chinese app. We're actually based in, at least legally, in the Cayman Islands. And the company put out diagrams that map out the company structure and how the parent companies and various other companies relate. And at the top of the tree is the Cayman Islands. Now, to anyone who has been following or analyzing the Chinese tech industry for the past 10 years, such a claim is just ridiculous. I mean, it may technically be true that by the black and white letter of the law, that they are legally domiciled in the Cayman Islands, but they are fundamentally a Chinese company. So I think, those two examples of the difference between the talking points illustrates the tension at play that you refer to. So ByteDance has a real commercial need to expand around the planet. And the reason why is because unlike other tech startups in China, they pointedly refused to take money from BAT, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent for the most part.
These are the biggest of the biggest Chinese tech giants that you're referring to.
That's right. And, as is the case in the United States, whenever there's a tech startup that has a really innovative app, the big tech giants in the US, Facebook, Amazon, Google, will try to buy it up. And so a similar process was happening in China. Now, I think there may have been some small deals here or there where they took on some money from some of these major players, but for the most part, they decided not to. And that meant that they were locking themselves into a strategy where they had to make it big overseas. The market in China is somewhat saturated, and for them to really become a big player themselves, they needed to make this strategic decision to go out into the world. Now, for all the reasons that we've already been discussing, that was setting themselves up on a collision course with their commercial goals on the one hand and the goals of the CCP on the other. And it was a collision that was easy to foresee even, a year, 2 years ago, that eventually there will be a crunch point where these two different motivating factors will have to collide, and who knows what the result of that collision would be.
Now, TikTok was not the first Chinese company to face these sorts of concerns in regard to data privacy and national security and their operations overseas. It's not going to be the last. I'm wondering if this is going to keep happening, where every time a Chinese company becomes popular in the US and other Western markets, the choice becomes either for an American company to buy them out or the government to ban them. I mean, from a regulatory perspective, surely there must be a better way to go about this.
I don't know what the solutions are, and I don't think anybody really does have a great fix. But I think you're right to say that the problem's not going away. I think my concern sometimes is that the way the debate plays out in the public is that oftentimes the security risks are too narrowly defined. So if you think about Huawei, for instance, the debate is often so focused on the risk of espionage. And while that's definitely a huge risk, I think it overlooks the other aspects that should be equally concerning. And we've touched on it with TikTok with the propaganda question. But it's also that, sometimes the companies that are engaged in the most questionable activities aren't necessarily the ones that you see. And sometimes, for instance, I did a report with ASPE in October of last year called Engineering Global Consent. And I wrote a case study about a company called Global Tone Communications Technology, and they engage in machine translation, and they claim to translate in 67 different languages, and their products get embedded. For instance, they have a relationship with Huawei that they talk about on their website, where they said that one of their translation devices is embedded in a Huawei smart conferencing solution, and that particular smart conferencing solution can be traced to a couple of contracts that Huawei has signed on smart city solutions overseas. Another place where GTCom claims to embed their technology is through Alibaba Cloud and Alibaba Cloud's translation services. The problem with the company GTCom is that they're actually a state-owned enterprise that's directly controlled by the Central Propaganda Department. And so the data that they're collecting, it's used to help perfect translation services that are provided through these other companies' products. But then also the company literally says that they're contributing directly to state security, both through facial and voice recognition data and using that to support state security. But they also have a person in their company who's claiming at an event, there's a sign behind him that in his presentation that read 90% of military grade intelligence comes from open source data collection. And they also collect from social media platforms. They collect from Facebook, Twitter, and I think they even said something about videos, and there was an agreement that linked them to YouTube. And so there's actually a huge, I think it's a tech supply chain cybersecurity problem as well, that if we're focusing just on individual companies, it's kind of like, it makes me think of what's that arcade game, the whack-a-mole game. It's like you're never going to get quite to the source of the problem because there's always going to be something else popping up. And really the source of the problem is a fundamental one that's not easy to confront because it is a political problem. There's no technical solutions to the problems we're talking about. I don't think data privacy laws solve the problems. And so really, I think what this highlights is the fact that, there's going to be other cases, is that we need to have a new way of thinking about and approaching the problem solving. And it's not going to be easy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I'm equally pessimistic about how these sorts of problems can be solved, at least from the non-PRC side. And I think that's part of the problem, that in the West, people are thinking, what can we do? What are the regulations we can have that can help solve this problem? But there really is a limit to what the rest of the world can do. At some point, Beijing and these tech companies that operate in the PRC, they need to realize that trust is very important when it comes to these sorts of apps and these sorts of companies. People have shown that they're willing to hand over huge amounts of data as long as they can be somewhat confident, at least, that there are checks and balances and protections in place. And unfortunately, in China, the regulatory approach that they have decided on is to completely remove any meaningful checks and balances and firewalls between people's personal data and the state. The one piece of legislation that inevitably comes up in these discussions is China's National Intelligence Law from 2017, which requires organizations and citizens to support, assist, and cooperate with state intelligence work. It's laws like that that make governments around the world, consumers around the world, increasingly wary about what is happening to my data if it is being sent back to Beijing. And at the end of the day, that's a problem that only Beijing can deal with. But because of how the Chinese Communist Party thinks and what its goals are, that's quite unlikely to happen.
And sometimes people will point to something like the privacy regulations that are being developed in the PRC and discussion on privacy protections as a way of saying, well, there is an important conversation happening in China on these issues. But the privacy stops where the party's power begins. And that's a key point. And the law matters in China, but the law matters for different reasons than it matters in a liberal democracy. Xi Jinping himself said in a speech that was published in February of last year, although I think it dated back to late 2018, he said, quote, comprehensively relying on the law to rule the country does not at all weaken the party's leadership, but rather strengthens and improves the party's leadership. And the end of the quote says that the law is relied upon to rule the country and consolidates the party's hold on power, and that's key. The law, it's a political tool that the party uses, and ultimately the party determines what the law is. I mean, I had a quote from the 80s too that basically said the law is what it says, what we say it is, whether or not it's written down, and so I think those are other key points as well, because it's easy to try to look at what might be coming out of the PRC and try to find some positive signs, but ultimately the party's pretty clear about what it wants, and I don't know that its objectives are going to change. I think we as collective liberal democracies were hoping that over time it would, over the last couple of decades, but I think it's shown actually, no, we want to shape global governance. We want to shape you. We don't want you to shape us. And so I don't think the party's going to change, and we just have to confront that reality and figure out what to do about it.
I'm sure President Trump wishes he could say that the law is what he says and not what's written down.
I'm sure. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Fergus, you touched on this a little bit earlier, and I wanted to ask before we sign off about the reaction to all of this from China, because I think that's been overlooked in a lot of the media coverage. The thought occurs to me that for a long time during China's meteoric economic rise, the conventional wisdom in the West, at least as I understood it, was that China's state-controlled economy was not conducive to technological dynamism and innovation. And that in the view of a lot of Western thinkers and strategists, as long as this austere sort of censorial form of political and social organization prevailed in China, there would never really be an equivalent of Silicon Valley there, or any kind of the national technological champions. That has now turned out to be a gross miscalculation. And the person sitting at home watching all this in China might just be thinking to themselves, well, the West underestimated Chinese technology companies, so now that our companies are spreading around the world and grabbing market share, they're cracking down to protect their own. Do either of you get the sense that that is a common perception, either among Chinese officials or in public opinion?
Yeah, I certainly do see that opinion, and I think that there is some merit to it. I think in the West, people often forget that a lot of the technology that we now enjoy would not exist were it not for some sort of industrial policy that helped create it in the first place. Silicon Valley, despite what many of the libertarian tech CEOs would like people to think, was not created completely off their own backs. Certainly their ingenuity, their ideas, their innovation is a key part of the recipe, but along the way, throughout the past 5 decades, it has been the role of the state in the United States of America that has also helped the development of these industries and this technology. And so personally, I think that part of what liberal democracies around the world need to be doing is is thinking about what can we learn from China's approach to these technologies, because it's not simply the fact that the state got out of the way of these companies in China, although that is part of the story. They have also been the state, has been very involved in setting out 5-year plans, deciding what industries and technologies should be focused on, and then providing state support to ensure that that kind of development happens. So I actually think that the problem in the West has been that we have been fooled by neoliberal ideology that we should simply let the market decide and let the market make these technological advances, when in fact what we should be doing is thinking, well, industrial policy has helped us in the past. It seems to be helping China at the moment. What can we learn about their experience that can help us be competitive?
Yeah, I agree with what Fergus has just said, and I would add sort of maybe thinking about a bigger picture issue in China-U.S. relations, and in fact, China's relations with other liberal democracies, is when you mentioned the debate about whether or not China can innovate, Elliot, it made me think, that question on its own and the way that researchers have approached that in the last couple of decades, oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes, it's almost it's a bit of it's a condescending question, I think, and it's not that we shouldn't be asking about how innovation is different in China, but it's almost as if we're underestimating the party state and for what it can do. One thing that you hear, of course, now is we can't just confront the PRC. We need to find ways to cooperate. And I think that's great. We do need to find ways to cooperate, but how are you going to cooperate if you don't know who you're dealing with? And I feel like we have some fundamental questions to get to if we're asking questions about whether or not China is capable of innovating. I think sometimes we're missing bigger points about just what makes that system different and how does it work versus does it have to look the same as our own, and how are we going to progress relations with China if we don't confront the reality of that situation. I hope that makes sense, but I think the question about innovation is one that I've always sort of thought about as being one that's almost peripheral to the real problems, and to actually coming up with real solutions. It's almost as if it's a question that we ask ourselves to make ourselves feel better, and sort of kick the can down the road about when it comes to problem solving and figuring out how do we deal with the world where the PRC is quite successful in this space.
Sam and Fergus, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Samantha Hoffman and Fergus Ryan are both analysts from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and WPR on Twitter. And if you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe for our free daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.